Well, thank you so much for coming this evening to our event, guys. Thanks really, really much. And yes, my name is Ozlem and I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham within the Department of Social Policy, Sociology and Criminology. I also work on the research project, which is called Birmingham Muslims in the City of the City with Dr. Chris Allen, who just here. Chris is going to tell more about this project today, a little bit later. But this event is being organised as a part of the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences. This festival was set up first in 2002 in order to promote social science research and to the audiences, non-specific audiences, and also to show, to kind of celebrate the social, political and economic research how it impacts in everyday life. So this year's festival runs all over the country, and more than 300 events like this being facilitated all around the country. So yes, we're going to today, I'm going to tell you what we're going to do today. Basically, we're going to have a panel discussion, presentation. First, every panelist is going to speak for 5 minutes, but it's going to be more like a conversational, really. We're going to make it more like informal, a bit of conversation. Okay, I'm going to introduce you now, and then after the panelists talk, I'm going to ask some questions, and then I'll give the floor to you to ask any questions you'd like to ask. Okay, we've got our panelist, Dr. Chris Allen. He's the lecturer in the in social policy in the Department of Social Policy, Sociology and Criminology, and he's going to tell more about his research. And also we've got bios printed for you, so if you want more information, please do refer there. And then we've got Dr. Chris Allen again, Dr. Arshad Isakjee.
Exactly.
It's
the beard and the glasses.
Just leave it hair needs, doesn't it? So yeah, well, Arshad was, we worked with Arshad previously. He was also from the University of Birmingham. He did his PhD and then also worked. But now he's in the University of Liverpool within the Department of Geography and Planning. Have I got that right? And also the Vivian Gerrand, and she's from University of Melbourne, but currently she's based in Italy within the, I'm going to ask you to tell, the European University. Yes, exactly. So we're going to now have 5 minutes of presentations, and I'm going to ask Chris to start.
Okay, so I guess really stepping back like just a little bit and thinking about the kind of the project that myself and Ozlem are running, Birmingham's Muslims in the city, of the city, and also the kind of idea behind this event was to kind of really start talking about how do we challenge this idea that Birmingham is a problem, and not only that Birmingham is a problem, but Birmingham's Muslims are a problem. And this has been something that's kind of really kind of been of interest to me, and also really been of a challenge to me as well, because I've increasingly kind of seen over the years these various issues which kind of unfold. They kind of hit the national newspapers, they kind of get spoken about in the kind of political spaces, and then all of a sudden, it kind of disappears, and Birmingham isn't that bad, and Birmingham's Muslims ain't that bad either, and we just kind of seem to have this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy at the kind of national level. So I've written a short brief, a comment piece that I'll circulate to all of you afterwards. I'll send it by email. But one of the things that for me was, I think a really good way of doing it is to look back just 6 months ago when Khalid Masood went to Westminster. He drove his car across Westminster Bridge, and then there was a handful of killings, and it was really interesting. So as an academic that engages with the media, within a few hours of the fact that it was realised that he was from Birmingham as the news was reporting it, was all of a sudden me and colleagues and my peers are suddenly being invited to talk in the media and asking questions, and the recurring question was, how did Birmingham become the jihadi hotspot of the world? And it was, you know, if anyone's engaged with the media, one of the big things is that, you know, it's like kind of, you have to kind of give an answer. They, you know, you can't say, well, it's not. They want the answer. It's like, well, you know, explain it. So, you know, and that's my point. And, you know, I had questions like, you know, is it the new Molenbeek? You know, like, so, you know, and that was from some Belgian journalists, and that was great. I felt as though they really wanted to wash their hands of the problems of Belgium and get it onto Birmingham as quickly as they could, you know, like, because, you know, the issue's been there. And then, like, when you know, then you kind of get this kind of whole thing, you know, the Hagley Road, and there's like, you know, news media from all around the world, and all camped out, and there's lots of people there, and there's interviews being done, and suddenly, like, you know, it's like, it's Birmingham's a problem, and the Daily Mail, you know, it's like, why Birmingham? You know, Birmingham, that's to blame. And then you kind of take about a month, 2 months on, and then you look back, and it's like, well, so he's only lived in Birmingham for a little while, and actually he'd lived in a lot of other places for a hell of a lot longer. But all of those things were kind of lost in the media reporting. And then it's like, well, he hired a car from Birmingham. And lots of people hire cars from Birmingham, you know, every single day, you know, like, and so, you know, so you have that. And then it's like, the Metropolitan Police say, well, you know, he had no links with, you know, any kind of Islamist groups, you know. He was inspired by what he'd seen in the media, what he'd kind of seen online, but there was no real links. I mean, I don't think, you know, from the investigations I've done, you know, it doesn't seem that he was linked to any particular mosque, or he had any kind of real community kind of links or so on. And so you take 2 months on, and you're like, wow, you know, so actually Birmingham wasn't the problem. You know, Birmingham really wasn't the problem. It was just like, it was someone who happened to be in Birmingham at that time who actually did something which was really awful, you know. But of course, like, you know, you're trying to kind of respond to that quickly. It's like, you know, well, let's blame Birmingham. And then, of course, like, you know, you get so, and I'm sure Arshad will touch upon this a bit later, is that, you know, so you get Trojan Horse, you get Operation Trojan Horse, and, you know, that's a plot to take over 20 schools, and, you know, it's hardline Islamists, and then within a couple of weeks, you know, West Midlands Police are saying, well, you know, we don't think the letter's real, it's a hoax. So it's like, okay, well, we'll try and find evidence of extremism. And then you get all of these kind of investigations. It's like, well, there's not really any extremism there, but, you know, it's kind of like, there's a few governance issues, you know, like, and so all of a sudden, like, you know, you realise that actually that wasn't the case, but, you know, it's hit the headlines. You know, there's covers of a Spectator with a small white kid, you know, a nice white middle class kid with a massive Quran under his arm and a big sword of Islam, because that's how Islam spread, by the sword, you know. And so you get this, and then, like, you know, it's like suddenly it's gone again. And then we have Project Champion, which Arshad no doubt we'll talk about. You know, suddenly there's all these cameras around, you know, kind of 2 areas. Well, you know, what areas are they around? Well, around the most densely populated Muslim areas in the city. But it's like, they're not there to watch the Muslims, they're there to kind of, you know, because they're high crime. And then, of course, it's like, well, they're not really high crime, you know, so you have all this kind of stuff. And what you get is this kind of constant thing at the national level in the kind of media, you know, that actually Birmingham is a problem. And that view that, you know, like that you know, there's no smoke without fire. You know, so it's very easy on the outside to kind of stand on the outside and look into Birmingham and say, well, there's a problem with the city and there's a problem with its Muslims. Now you can take that right to the kind of extreme, and I don't know if any of you remember Steve Emerson from Fox News, and you know, it's like Birmingham is a Muslim-only city. You know, Sharia police, you know, kind of walking around. You know, like, I mean, you know, good luck to, you know, those of you who are not Muslim on the way back. You know, because the Sharia police, you know, probably like are out after dark. You know, but you know, this idea that actually, so it's a Muslim-only city, that, you know, like non-Muslims can't go to the city. You know, it's run by Muslims, and Muslim gangs are taking over, and this whole narrative around Islamification. You know, so again, you know, this is going out on an international stage now. You know, this international level that Birmingham is. Not only is it a problem, but it's a problem because of the Muslims. The Muslims have taken over. And so for me, and I'll just wrap up, you know, so, you know, in terms of one of the big challenges for me in terms of my research and in terms of what we're doing with Ozlem is that it's about how do we bring about some change. You know, and sometimes it's not about trying to change the world. We can't change the narrative of Fox News. We can't change the narrative of, you know, like sort of the Sun or the, you know, the Daily Mail or so on. But what we can do is we can try and start to have conversations. We can start to try and use our research in a way that actually can feed in and kind of change. And maybe we change this much, whereas we need to change this much, and well, maybe that's how much we do at a time, and we move on in terms of that. So yeah, so I'll pick up on some more in a bit.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris.
Okay. So yeah, my name's Arshad Isakjee. I'm a lecturer at the University of Liverpool, and I did my PhD on Muslim identities and how they were impacted by counter-terrorism policies here at the University of Birmingham between 2008 and 2012. I guess I want to sort of go between sort of with this very short, just a couple of minutes, between the sort of personal, emotional, place-based and structural stuff, and also the sort of politics around Muslim identities. Because I think what's interesting. I mean, I started my PhD and I applied for sort of funding, Research Council funding for it. And when it started, it was I'm a geographer, and I was interested in how people's identities are tied to places. And I thought, from sort of having lived in Birmingham for a long time and knowing quite a lot of the sort of various Muslim communities in inverted commas, I thought that would make for a really interesting project. It got funded. And then I started doing sort of interviews with lots of people, but you could never get too far away from the politics because they were happening all the time. Okay, so 2008, a few years after 7/7, 7 odd years after 9/11, and also the Prevent Pathfinder was starting as well. So if you go to youth and community organisations, Muslim organisations at this time, invariably there's some Prevent-related things going on, discussions, and sometimes some schemes are being funded by Prevent. At the same time, 2008, 2009, we've had Labour's comprehensive spending review at the, which came off the back of the financial crisis, right? And Birmingham City Council are making cuts. I mean, I can't emphasise this enough. I was at a presentation today about Liverpool City Council earlier in the day. They've had 53% cuts in local authority money. The cuts that have happened over the last 10 years in cities like Birmingham and Liverpool make Thatcher look like nothing. Like, honestly, if you look at the actual numbers, that causes serious problems in city, neighbourhoods in the city of Birmingham. It means that all the provisions that were expected to be there and we took for granted are no longer there. In this atmosphere, Prevent was coming in, and Prevent then was very different to what it is now, as we'll no doubt sort of discuss later on. It was aimed to do something sort of, it was aimed to sort of mesh in with community to a greater degree than it is now. So it wasn't institutionalised in schools and hospitals and so forth, in universities in the same way that it is now. But it was still problematic. But what I think is really interesting and something to note is that when funding is constricted, even if Muslim actors and organisations will not agree with the policy or the objectives, because funding is available, because there's a chance to influence that policy rather than let someone else lead it, people will engage. But that creates all sorts of problems. And I think that as a microcosm, that pretty much is the way I see a lot of Muslim organisations nationally working today, wanting to be at the table when it comes to policy, not necessarily agreeing with the policies, slamming other Muslim organisations because they're competitors for funding. And I find this very depressing and a key sort of challenge for Muslim representation. Anyway, you had all this political stuff going on. Chris mentioned Project Champion, the installation of 200 plus security cameras in the densely populated Muslim parts of the city, which I wrote with Chris about, and which also formed a key part of the PhD. I mean, one of the things that interesting that showed is just how, the extent of the anger of the people who lived in those communities, because it's now our streets are being securitized. The organisation that was installed the cameras, previously did security work in Iraq and Afghanistan. But to be honest, on reflection, and we'll have time to come back to this in the discussion, I think looking back, have a sort of Project Champion undermined trust so much between authorities and local Muslims. I think the Trojan horse affair will have more long-lasting consequences. But we can come to that later. I guess my sort of broader point is, what do we lose when we hear constantly discourses of radicalisation, security problems, of Muslim identities themselves, of young people being thought of as something that needs to be that's sort of almost verging towards the criminal unless it's prevented. I know that's very difficult for policymakers, since policymakers are there to address these issues, and they have to devise policies to challenge things like gang crime or whatever. But there's so many more mundane things that are going on that are equally important and get lost in those narratives. Okay, for South Asian Muslims who've been in the city for 40, 50 years, it's not diasporas anymore. 20 years ago, we used to talk about diasporas, even 10 years ago, I guess. But they're not diasporas anymore. They're British-born Muslims who identify primarily with this country and would feel massively out of place if they went back to Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. Whenever they get the chance to go there. Obviously, there are new emergent communities in Birmingham as well, which has made the sort of Muslim communities in the city more diverse. But make no mistake, Muslims in Birmingham feel British and they feel attached to the city and they feel attached to various neighbourhoods. And the problems that young Muslims are facing, often, in their everyday lives, are the same problems that other young people in Birmingham are facing. Okay, how do I get onto the housing ladder when a house that would have cost 50 grand 15, 16 years ago now costs 130 grand? How do I do that? How do I get the job that allows me to do that when university admissions rates vary between, even when you equalise for the same grade between people who are white, Bangladeshi, and so I think the offers for white students around 57%. This is levelled for the same grades, and they're much lower in sort of for Pakistanis and Indians and so forth. But there are all sorts of other structural things I'll go into in sort of Q&A, which I think are very relevant in this regard and something we can't lose sight of. But there's a big disconnect and disjuncture when these are the everyday thoughts and problems that young Muslims are facing, but that's the way they're being represented in relation to security, and that can be a frustrating thing, I think, for young Muslim people.
That's good. Thank you very much, Arshad.
It's a great way into what I want to talk about, which is about the way in which young people with a Somali background use images to build resilience to some of these things, to some of the ways in which they're being misrepresented, to the sorts of discourses we see in the media. So how are young people using images, in particular in the online space, to create a sense of strong and complex cultural identity that actually resists some of these discourses that have become part and parcel of everyday tabloid media now, not just in the UK, unfortunately, but in a number of countries, thinking particularly of the US, but also my country, Australia. So this project that I'm beginning now is titled The Role of Image Making in the Prevention of Violent Extremism. And that may sound like a controversial kind of combination of things, but really it's drawing on some of these ideas of representation that I've worked on in the past. I completed a PhD looking at Somali settlement in Australia and Italy, which became the subject of this book, titled Possible Spaces of Somali Belonging. And in this study I looked at the way that representations in mainstream media, but also representations created by Somalis, so self-representation, can detract from belonging or can lead to a greater sense of belonging. So the ways in which representations are used is critical in the sort of self-image people have, in the kind of image that the society has of different members of its society. And Somalis have often been reported as vulnerable, they've been criminalised, securitized, and so this study has been interested in how do they actually live in complex daily ways like anybody else, how do they represent themselves. And so this study I'm doing now is taking up some of those ideas that belonging can be created through image making, particular kinds of nuanced and complex image making, and applying it to the context of Birmingham, London, Rome and Turin. I'm currently based in Italy, starting the study, and it's a pilot study to look at how images can be used to, I suppose in a way, speak back as well to some of these dominant frames and to conframe issues differently, to create further dialogue between communities and strengthen young people's resilience to some of these narratives, to strengthen their sense of purpose, meaning, to find out what sort of things they're creating. Now I haven't even started actually in talking to people yet. I'm beginning my first discussion this week here in Birmingham, so it's at the very initial stage. I'd be really keen to hear your views on this type of project, on for other people that might be interested in being part of it. If you know of people in Birmingham who'd like to join, that would be fantastic. And yeah, what more can I say? It's really good to be able to speak to you about this project, particularly as it's in its initial stage.
That's what I was going to say, because one of the interesting things, so for those of you who are not aware, so myself and Ozlem have just done some research with secondary migrant Somalis in Birmingham. It's been really interesting because it's kind of brought up a lot of real issues around identity and belonging. And one of the really interesting things was that we kind of stumbled into this research because I was facilitating a workshop with young Muslim men in the city, and I was asked to go along and kind of ask them, I kind of work around what some of the problems or the challenges were for them in the city. And so this was like, when was this, like Muslim last year? It must have been...
It was back in
November,
February, March 2006.
No, it was later than that.
Later.
Anyway, we're arguing
Okay.
about it. But, so it was sometime later.
Yeah.
And one of the so I was expecting them to talk about some of the stuff that you were saying, Arshad, like around like that. And what I noticed was that the vast majority were of Somali heritage, and so I asked, what's the biggest issue? And the question comes up, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to go to university without paying international fees. I don't know if I'm going to be able to stay. I was kind of like, where's these questions come from? And then, of course, they explain that they're secondary migrants. So most of a high percentage of the Somalis that are in Birmingham claimed asylum or citizenship in, say, the Netherlands or Sweden or Finland or Denmark or any of these kind of countries, but then came to Birmingham because they felt it was a Muslim city.
They were more at home.
So they come to Birmingham because they feel that they can be Muslim, they can be they are. They feel that there's less kind of like discrimination. There's less kind of like there's more chance for them to be kind of be themselves, have their identity. But of course, Brexit, the Brexit referendum, had kind of thrown all this like kind of their sense of belonging into disarray. And so it was really interesting for me. I'd gone along expecting like all this stuff, and then all of a sudden it was like, no, actually Brexit just throws that whole sense of belonging into disarray. And so it's really interesting because even when we think that what we think some of the issues are, it's very easy for issues around identity, belonging to be challenged. And some of the stuff that it's good to say. Do you want to say something about some of the people we met, like Mohammed Sweden? I love Mohammed Sweden.
Well, what was really interesting about this research project, the Somalis we talked to, they had loads of complex, identities, belongings. They had elements of Somalis, they had elements of Muslim identity, they had elements of Europeanness and Britishness. So obviously, as Chris said, Brexit just made them all turn upside down. So, but in a very short of time, these people actually felt very belonged to the city. They felt that this was home, this was where they wanted to carry on living, and their children wanted to build their lives here. So they had lots of aspirations and plans. So basically, as this very short time, the Birmingham city, as a city, big city, provided them with lots of meanings, a sense of feeling, being at home. So I was going to actually, that takes me very nicely to my question, because I like to ask 3 questions, not more than 3 questions, and then I'm going to ask audience to ask their questions. But so, given our research collectively shows that there is a strong sense of belonging amongst the different Muslim communities living in the city, why do you think has this city and its Muslim communities been seen to be somehow problematic? Which of you want to go first? Yeah,
all right.
go on.
Well, I think it's the representation of Muslims is always going to be tricky because it's such a useful political football. It's such a useful political tool. Just take sort of David Cameron as sort of as an example, the Munich speech. I think probably actually on reflection, it'll probably go down as one of the most vacuous politicians that have ever sort of been Prime Minister. In that sense, he doesn't really stand for anything.
You've attacked Thatcher and Cameron. I'm beginning to think you might be a left winger. Am I right?
I don't know.
No, the Munich speech was a great. It's built up the whole sort of. We're going to deal with Prevent. We're going to, there's this whole narrative for about a year of what the Tory party is going to do with Prevent is we're going to separate out extremism and cohesion, because how communities get along with each other has got nothing to do with extremism. Like, they're separate issues. And then in one speech he puts them together. Why? Because it's convenient, and it's a convenient narrative to throw at the time. It makes a certain political base really happy, and suddenly that's the way the representation works. Look at the Casey report, exactly the same. 5 years on, You know, and you know, I mean, Louise Casey was the same person who wrote the report on troubled families, with this weird hypothesis that actually there's only a few hundred like troubled families in the UK, or a few thousand, you know, a few hundred in every city, that are causing all the social problems, and then that turned out to be complete nonsense, and billions of pounds were wasted. You know, that's Louise Casey, and then she, you know, again, like a sort of very anecdote-ridden report, which basically tries to link up cohesion and extremism in a way which doesn't work. It's not true. But a lot of people want to believe it's true, and there's you know, again, you can make political capital out of that, saying what should we do about the Muslim problem. So it's you know, it's and it's true that, you know, I think it's undoubtable that, you know, right-wing coalitions and parties have been more willing to do that everywhere than their left-wing counterparts. I think that's undeniable. Really.
You see, one of the point you're making there about the kind of political climate is really interesting, because we've been doing some focus groups for young Muslims in the city. It's always interesting the way in which you kind of like, you know, the way in which kind of problems are framed and the way in which problems become interpreted, and like you're saying, you know, this is really interesting, because the political climate can actually make problems seem worse than, you know, so if something is perceived to be a problem, the political climate can actually reinforce that. And actually become like so for the politicians, they can increasingly point the finger at those Muslim communities and at Birmingham and say, well, it's increasingly problematic. And I'll give an example. So, you know, in academic terms, you know, if you know, we see, you know, in Birmingham you have like kind of Irish areas, and you have like Muslim areas, and you have Sikh areas, and all, you know, white middle class areas, and all of this. So depending upon where you want to sit in the academic debate, you can either say that's clustering. So that's the kind of nice way, is that people want to be together, so they want to be with people that they're like, you know, people that are similar to them. They cluster. It's where they're kind of like their spiritual, their religious, their kind of ethnic needs can be collected. The politicians, on the other hand, like to call it segregation. You know, like, so it's like no. So it's not about them gathering together because, you know, their needs can be met. It's actually because they don't want to be a part of who we are. You know, like, so, and that narrative is really, really problematic. So we've got, so as a city, you know, we are, I would say, we have like very distinct areas, and I think that adds to the city. Well, that's my own interpretation. I think it adds, but also you can say that certain areas are distinctly, you know, sort of, you know, maybe ethnic or religious or, you know, or other. Now, from the research, from the focus groups we've been doing, one of the interesting things with this is that in this kind of political climate, you know, post-Brexit, you know, where hate crimes are going up, you know, in an environment where, you know, like sort of, you know, young people feel that the lens of kind of scrutiny is on them a lot more. One of the things that the young Muslims that come out of this took me and Ozlem by absolute surprise, was that places like the kind of so Paul Gilroy talks about, you know, the urban city centres as being convivial multiculturalism. It's like we all share that space, we all get on, and we rub along with each other, and, you know, like, and that kind of works. What we found from the focus groups was that the young Muslims are saying we don't like going to these spaces now because we feel we might be attacked. We feel that we're really under you know, kind of scrutiny. When we do go there, we have to self-censor. So, you know, we had some of the guys saying, I don't like to wear a backpack, you know, like we had
on mobile phone.
Yeah, I don't like to read, like, you know, the Quran on the phone, you know, I don't like any of these things. And then saying, well, actually, the places we feel most comfortable, we still feel we belong in Birmingham, we still feel as though we, you know, this is where our identity is, but we feel like we best belong and we're more secure and more safe in the areas where we live. Now, of course, you see, now this, because if you take away that political climate, if you take away the kind of post-Brexit, the kind of the levels of intolerance, you know, we're becoming more intolerant, we're becoming more hateful, you know, all of this. If you take all that away, it's very easy to spin that narrative and say, well, look at the Muslims, the young Muslims. Increasingly, they want to stay in their own areas. And so, you know, so it's really important that these lenses, you know, and the frames through which the politicians want to present these problems are actually challenged, you see, and this is why these kind of events and what all of us are trying to do in research, and this is where social science becomes so important, is because actually we can try and provide a counter-narrative to that.
Yeah. Did you want to say something on this?
Oh, I agree completely. Yeah. I think that Brexit's had really difficult effects on young people who previously felt a great sense of belonging in Birmingham and gravitated, as you said, with secondary migration here. And now, from some preliminary conversations I've had with members of the Somali community in Birmingham, it sounds like young people are feeling like they need to go elsewhere in order to have a future in which they feel, they can have a life of dignity, because they're feeling like they're under attack now, consequently.
And what's really interesting, when we did research into Somali families, within weeks some had left, haven't they? I mean,
yes,
some had left.
Yes, some members of founders
just made that decision, like, we're off. That's it. One of the things with my research, I always say that my research, is about real people. It's about real people. It's about human experience. It's about real life. And actually, the most interesting part of my research is actually telling people's stories and telling people's experiences. And what was really interesting was when we were doing the Somali research, was that it's very easy to go, oh, they left straight away. But actually, it was the consequences, because when you start talking to the people that were left, it was like their mum had left, or their brother or sister had left, and so suddenly they had these family kind of kinship networks. That's what made Birmingham feel like home. And then suddenly it was just destroyed. And so it's not. It's also complex. It's also multi-layered. And yet, like as you say, when you get Cameron doing the muscular liberalism thing, and saying, "Oh, people don't want to belong," actually, it's like you say, it's pretty vacuous, and it's deliberately done to kind of mislead.
Yeah, I mean, and the point of that speech is that they overturned their own sort of policy agendas at the time, just for the convenience of that, discourse and the few nights of coverage that speech would probably get, or a few news cycles. And I think that's the way a lot of politicians generally tend to use Muslim issues, especially very senior ones, and especially in the sort of, the right-wing parties.
And it drives me mad. I hate the argument that multiculturalism is dead. Just for crying out loud, multiculturalism isn't dead. It just drives me mad, because it's like these politicians need to open their eyes, because they can keep telling everyone, but actually it's not going away, and so we need to challenge that narrative as well.
Okay. My next question is, as regards to, as researchers, our job is obviously look at the challenges as well as the opportunities. So in terms of the Birmingham's cities Muslims, what are the greatest challenges that face in the foreseeable future?
Well, everyone's looking at me.
I am. I'm looking at all of you.
So in the piece that I write, the first half, I kind of challenge this notion that Birmingham, that Birmingham is a problem, from the outside, that Birmingham as Birmingham's Muslims as a problem. I mean, we do also have problems. I mean, Arshad's touched upon the issue around extremism. We know that there are handfuls of people around the city that actually, want to commit, kind of extremist activities. They want to put their extremist ideologies and views into practice. Now,
that's not limited to Muslims, so that's
and that's the point I was going to say, because actually, if we look back over the last month and a half, we've had a number of arrests around the banned group National Action. So there are extremism exists in every community, and one of the things that I think that we're finding now is that. And this is my own personal view. I think in this country that we have allowed the far right to get away with too much for too long. We've allowed the far right to be more aggressive. We've allowed the far right to become more confrontational. We've allowed the far right to kind of pretty much dictate what they want to do. And I know that's very difficult in terms of, I'm not criticising the policing or the management of the marches or the movements, but I think in terms of the narrative, we've never really challenged the narrative. And you can look back to 2007, and after 7/7, and you had the British National Party, and there, you look at the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. This is one of the most diverse areas of the country, huge diverse areas of the country, and the BNP can go in there and they campaign on a far right neo-Nazi agenda, a racist agenda, of saying too much multicultural, too many non-white people, too many Muslims, too many terrorists, and so on. And they became the first party in the history of Britain to be the official party of opposition in any political space. Now, if that can happen in one of the most diverse areas in London, where were Labour, where were Conservatives, where were the Lib Dems in challenging that narrative? Because at that time, the argument was, oh well, they're just a fringe group. But actually, with the right mobilisation, with the right kind of support, the far right can be very, very dangerous. And as is same with all extremism, and I think that extremism is one of the big challenges for Birmingham. We know it exists. We know there are handfuls of people on different persuasions, and it's how do we address that in a way that's meaningful, in a way that people feel that they can buy into it, and in a way that actually, that we can all agree what is the start point that we come from in terms of this.
Thank you, Chris. What about you guys? What do you think?
Shall I go first?
Are you going to do that thing like I agree with Nick? You could say I agree with Chris.
Yeah. I don't know. I suppose the biggest challenges. I guess the biggest challenges are first socioeconomic. I already touched upon that in terms of education, employment. The disparities have been improving. I mean, there's been really excellent reports by Runnymede Trust on employment recently of minorities and the sort of gaps that exist even for people of the same qualification. The Sutton Trust did an excellent report into higher education, which has similar things. I mean, one of the big outcomes of I focus on that in what probably the best thing that tourism may well achieve. And I'm not going to just criticise right-wing MPs. Is that I think that. All the names of university applicants are now going to be hidden from view of applicants to basically cut down on that gap, and I think that will be. I think that will go a long way towards solving that problem. So I think they've got the socioeconomic stuff, especially when house prices are rising in a city like Birmingham, which is doing generally quite well compared to the rest of the country. I think the other thing, and I think this is probably a more delicate thing, is issues around sort of secularism, schooling, and society, and I think that that's something that's not going to go away. And Trojan Horse is much more difficult than Project Champion. Project Champion can always be drawn up as an institutional cock-up. And everyone on every political side said, the police messed up, except for the right will just say the police messed up because they just messed up clerically. And the sort of, I guess people, the activists will say, no, you messed up because this is a sort of, this is racism coming into being and suddenly existing on our streets and in our institutions. That's the difference. But everyone can agree that it's a mess up. With Trojan Horse, no one can agree on what happened and what didn't happen. And from the stuff that I've read and people that I've spoken to, I think there are grains of truth in some things. There are misrepresentations in others. It's complex and it's nuanced. No one likes to hear that, but it's true. But they also touch upon things that are going on. See, a lot of people think, the daily issues of sort of young Muslims tends to be, am I challenging extremism? Extremism is something that most Muslims hardly ever encounter. They wouldn't encounter it. Terrorists generally operate in secret, and it takes chance and suspicion and all those sorts of things for people to realise that someone might be becoming extremist. They go to lengths to hide themselves. But the kinds of daily negotiations that Muslims go through in order to sort of fit in with society are sort of they're more mundane, but in a way they're more important. And that's sort of identities. I think it's changing now for newer generations. But how do you handle sort of relatively conservative home lives, schooling, where if you're comfortable and you get to also practice religiously and your beliefs, you actually do better in school. But then will schools have a religious ethos? The discomfort of local authorities, or certainly the press, when they see that schools might be inculcating some of that religious ethos into their educational systems. And the way this all comes together, and then if things don't work out, when school standards fall, if students aren't comfortable or whatever, then often the reaction can be, well, more children going to Islamic schools and separatism in terms of schools, which I don't think is particularly helpful either. And so I think that this is a more sort of this is one of the greatest challenges sort of going forward.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes complete sense and also resonates with some of the work I've done in the space of community resilience to violent extremism, which is a project I was recently working on in my city of Melbourne, looking at youth resilience to violent extremism in Canada and Australia. So that was a quantitative survey that was done with 200 people between 18 and 30 years old in Canada and in Australia, in 3 different cities in each country. And that found that resilience is contingent upon a number of factors, and the reasons why people might become involved in extremism is usually due to some of the push factors that you outlined, like the socioeconomic things, but also to the pull factors that are involved in, for example, online spaces where extremist groups now have incredible range of platforms that they can use to promote their ideologies to vulnerable people who may be feeling they don't have much of a future, they may feel discriminated against. And that can be the case for any young person, it doesn't matter what their background is. But some of those issues particularly can be reinforced by mainstream media accounts, which further work to discriminate people and make them even more vulnerable. So I think media responsibility is something that must be addressed both at the level of dominant media and governance, and also at the level of online spaces and social networking sites such as Facebook, Telegram, Twitter. How can we work with some of these huge now corporations that are governing these online spaces that aren't really fully regulated yet in terms of things like fake news? How can we work with them as well to reduce some of the pull factors, both for anyone, not simply one community, but all young people or anyone who's vulnerable in these spaces, so that they're no longer being seduced so much. So addressing the push factors such as the employment questions, the schooling, but also what are the seductive narratives, what are the unique selling points of some of these extremist groups, and how can we offer, I suppose, as societies, similar selling points but that direct young people, whatever their background, towards constructive and creative work, or build on the constructive and creative work they're already doing, but make it much more public so that it has a different kind of platform to what it has now.
I've got one other challenge. Sorry, I just remembered another one. So the other issue as well is that Birmingham is going to have a Muslim flavour in the future. The percentage population of Birmingham which identifies Muslim isn't going to go away, and it's not going to go down, in the foreseeable future. So the city will have a Muslim flavour, no matter what anybody kind of says and one of the big challenges of that is, and it kind of touches upon the Trojan horse, is that it's going to be very easy that some of the social problems and social issues that affect us all in the city can, because of the fact that Birmingham will have a significant number of Muslims, it will be very easy to deflect attention from that and say that's the problem of the Muslims. It's not a problem for all of us, And actually, that's that's something that we need to really, really kind of be aware of, because actually a lot of the issues, whether it comes down to housing or unemployment or education, actually, schools may be failing right across a lot of areas where there's high levels of deprivation or poverty and so on. Actually, we know that the majority of Muslims in the city live in those very high poverty areas, and it's going to be very easy in future, as cuts come in, and also from that kind of external kind of like perception stuff, to say, well, actually, that's the problem with Muslims. Muslims have created that problem. We don't need to worry about that. The problem of taking over schools, that's not the problem of Muslims. The thing about localisation and localism and reflecting your communities, that's a Muslim problem, and that is something that we really have to be aware of, because Birmingham will have a Muslim flavour.
Okay, my last question is, now we talk about the challenges, what about the opportunities that we face today in terms of the city and in terms of the Muslims and their communities? Shall we start with you this time? It's not fair.
Well, I think, the approach that I'm taking in the work I'm trying to do at the moment is to think in a strengths-based model rather than in a vulnerabilities-based one. So what are the strengths that, for example, a marginalised Muslim community can bring to this space? What can we learn from the experiences, for example, of Somali youth? What do they have to teach us about resilience? So they have a lot, from what I've done, the study I've done so far, they have a lot to teach the wider community. So thinking in terms of resources and strengths, I think, is a good place to start. Tapping into what young people are already doing. Most young people are doing this. A very small minority is not. So we need to focus more on what the majority is doing that's positive, and make sure that gets out. Because at the moment it's like the minority is getting this huge sort of publicity and making everyone frightened and fearful, and deepening the polarisation that exists in dangerous ways that reinforces the far right, that reinforces the Islamist groups. Both of these groups have a political interest in polarising society. They want people to be scared so that then they get more people recruited to their warped political agendas. So how can we actually get that sort of narrative of the ordinary person out there, of young people who actually have so much to offer and who are incredible in the way that they manage the resources they have, the limited resources they have at their disposition. So how do we get to a point of thinking about young people and their strengths and resilience rather than their weaknesses and vulnerabilities?
I guess there's probably reasons for optimism. There's 2 or 3 things. First, just the forces of time, which generally tends to push people together. I mean, I teach a course on sort of here immigration politics, and looking at American immigration politics, and then in the early 19th century, even people like Benjamin Franklin, the sort of stalwart intellectual liberal, is complaining about the number of Germans who were not considered white at that time, and then 30 years later they're considered white. Then the Italians come and the Irish come, and they're not considered white for about 40, 50 years, and then later they're considered white, because you've got the Chinese peril starting in the 1890s, and eventually, these things could sort of work in phases, and society works through them through time. And I think that there'll be something along those lines with cities with large Muslim populations. So I think that's one thing. Second thing is youth, because never underestimate the ability of young people to sort of solve problems which their parents couldn't. I think that's definitely something. And the third thing is that I think Birmingham has. I'm quite critical of national level organisations, Muslim organisations who are really good at talking, but Muslim organisations in Birmingham at a local level are very good at doing things. And I think that ultimately there's going to have to be a sort of, it's imperfect because there's no such thing as a Muslim community. Most of the organisations will never meet. Most people, Muslims on the ground will never know much about any of those organisations' work or what they say or how they represent. But PR is important. And Muslim organisations basically that are doing things are probably more likely to make the concessions and have the conversations with groups they don't necessarily see eye to eye with, or they don't share a common heritage with, to basically set up a way of representing the multiple communities that constitute the Muslim communities of Birmingham. And I think that PR will be assisted by sort of capable local level organisations going forward.
I'll come at it from a different point of view. In terms of an opportunity, I want to look back at terms of, it's the ESRC Festival of Social Science, and look at the opportunity that is presented in terms of social science and social scientists. And if you look at the University of Birmingham, the University of Birmingham was the first civic university. It was the first university to be set up in the city, to be actually of the city. And actually, I think that to some extent, as a university, we have detached ourselves. I think that we are in the city, but I'm not quite sure that we are of the city at times. And I think that, when it comes to something like this, because so many of these issues that we're talking about are so critical, they're so critical that, they need people that can give evidence. They need people that we can give, kind of information, we can share, we can work with, we can support, we can collaborate. Now, and I think so. The opportunity for us is that as a university and as social scientists, we have a responsibility and a duty to actually begin to kind of move out those kind of like those ivory towers and start looking at where we can make a meaningful contribution. And I think that in terms of this project that we've got, the 3-year project, it's purely about public and civic engagement. It's about us being able to facilitate these conversations. Admittedly, I'd love to have had 10 times the amount of people here, and have these conversations. But actually, having those conversations, being able to talk frankly, being able to talk openly, being able to kind of challenge and, hopefully, so you will challenge us, in the Q&A afterwards. But actually, it's about that responsibility. And I think that as an opportunity exists now for us as a university, for us as social scientists, to really begin to work with others where we can feed in, where we can support, where we can, consult, and really begin to challenge all of these things. The negative, the extremist ideologies, the negative representations. Challenge these socio-economic issues, challenge these political issues, challenge the kind of narratives that come out. And I think that is a fantastic opportunity in terms of social scientists, but I think it's also a massive challenge. I am not always sure that most of my colleagues are up for it. So I'll have a little dig at them.
We won't go there. Well, thank you very much, guys.